Before this episode begins, let's take a moment to speak of Jazz Journalists Association activities. 8 nominees for our 2025 Book of the Year Awards and 15 honorable mentions are posted at jjanews.org, along with other articles from our international membership. And we urge you to take a look at the Jazz Omnibus, the 600-page anthology of 21st century photos and writings by members of the Jazz Journalists Association, available online and wherever books are sold. And now, on with the show.
Hello, and welcome to The Buzz, the podcast of the Jazz Journalists Association, an international professional organization of writers, photographers, and broadcasters focused on jazz. I'm Neil Tesser, a founding member and board member of the JJA, and your host today for a discussion with Will Friedwald, journalist, celebrated author, radio host, one of New York's true jazz bon vivants. That resume earned him the JJA's Lifetime Achievement Award for 2024. Will has written extensively about singers and the songs they sing, including Straighten Up and Fly Right, his biography of Nat King Cole, and he worked with Tony Bennett on the legendary singer's autobiography. Friedwald's most recent book is a collection of his articles about jazz pianists, many of which appeared in the Wall Street Journal, entitled Nights at the Red Steinway. I'm Neil Tesser. I'm a board member of the Jazz Journalists Association, and I'm speaking here today for The Buzz with Will Friedwald, who is the 2024 recipient of the Jazz Journalists Association's Lifetime Achievement Award. Congratulations, Will. I don't mind saying I was happy to vote for you for this year, and I'm really glad to see that you got it. You've been doing so much good work in so many different media for so long. It seems it was about time for this to happen.
Well, thank you. It makes me feel two things. First of all, for me to get it makes me think they must have run out of good people, so they're going to the next level down.
Not at all.
There's only so many of us. And the second thing is they started listing me as a nominee almost 10 years ago. And the fact that now they've given it to me means that I must be over 60, and indeed I am. So there you go. So
it's kind of like the Baseball Hall of Fame. Sometimes it takes a while for each recipient to kind of bubble up in the voting.
You have to age into it, exactly.
Well, there's something to that. I mean, when there are people who have been doing this for 30 and 40 years, which I guess at this point describes you, it sometimes behooves the voters, the people who are in the Jazz Journalists Association, to kind of grab them first. But it's your time, and I'm really happy to see it.
Well, thank you.
You have, as I said, I kind of touched on the fact that you have this amazingly varied and eclectic career. And as someone who has worked in various media myself for all the time I've been doing this, I'm duly impressed. I mean, I know people who go, you do this, you do that. And I think, well, go talk to Will Friedwald because he's doing 3 times as much. But I thought maybe we'll start with your career as an author, because you've written a number of books that are really well received and really well written. So I guess that we would call the books on Sinatra and Nat Cole sort of critical biographies, right? They're like biography and music analysis.
That's the idea. In fact, I mean, with Sinatra, even when I started, there were a zillion books on Sinatra and not one book on the music. I mean, there were 50 books on the marriages and the mafia and the women and all these other sort of, and the Kennedys and all these other unsavory associations, but not one person ever wrote a book about the music. And even now, pretty much the only one, although there are some other good books about some other excellent books about his life and career, Chuck Renata's book and Jim Kaplan. But still, I think I can claim I've written the only book about Sinatra where the primary focus is on the music and the music itself.
And so, I think we'd say the same about your book on Nat King Cole.
Well, that was a fun one because I've been wanting to do that for so many years. As long as I've been writing about Sinatra, also, of course, Nat Cole crossed paths with the same people, the same arrangers, Billy May, Nelson Riddle, Gordon Jenkins, Capitol Records. And so it's sort of the other half of a story. And where Sinatra is like, the immigrant story, Nat Cole is the migrant story, because the Sinatra story begins with his father coming from Sicily. Then the Nat Cole story begins with his family and young Nat, who's 3 years old, migrating up from Alabama, from Montgomery, Alabama to Chicago.
You've written several books on him and done huge liner note essays on several of his reissues, and we'll get to that in a moment. But between those books and you co-wrote Tony Bennett's autobiography, worked with him on that, your biographical guide to the great jazz and pop singers, your extensive guide to jazz singing in general. It's fair to say that vocalists have been kind of the guiding principle for your work, isn't it?
Well, yeah, that's one thing I became interested in was jazz singers at an early point. You know, on one hand, I'm really drawn not only to performance, but to the songs themselves. And to me, the songs, that's like a good starting point, because then at a certain point, it occurred to me that Tony Bennett and Sonny Rollins have essentially the same repertory. You know, they're both doing the same songs, more or less. You know, they're both doing Irving Berlin and Cole Porter and Rodgers and Hammerstein. So what is it about this music that guys who are as different, or maybe not so different, as Tony Bennett and Sonny Rollins, what is it that they have in common? And to me, it all goes through the songs. So whether it's a jazz improviser, I mean, Lee Konitz had the greatest taste in songs, all the great piano players I love to write about, as well as the great singers. I mean, it's the songs that drive it all. And in most of my work, I think that's the common thread, was that these are people that perform these songs one way or another. Some are more truthful to the way, not more truthful, but maybe more authentic, maybe more sticking to the way they're written. Others improvise more. Others change the songs completely so their own composers don't even recognize them. And that can be great too. And of course, it took me a while. It wasn't until I was in my 40s that I started to appreciate other kinds of songs, like Bob Dylan and the singer-songwriters and Joni Mitchell and Tom Waits, all of whom I now love. But it took me longer to get to them, you know, just because that was like the through point for me, was the songs themselves. So to get to people that essentially did their own songs was a hurdle I had to make. But I did that 20 years ago, and now I think I'm confident to deal with those guys as well. Although I have to say that, and I made this point to Michael Feinstein. The other thing about me is I'm a unstoppable name dropper. So I was having this very point. I made this argument with Michael Feinstein. I said, the more you get to like Bob Dylan and Tom Waits and Joni Mitchell, it doesn't mean the less you like Richard Rodgers and Cole Porter. In fact, after studying the singer-songwriter guys, I like Jerome Kern and Cole Porter even more. It makes me appreciate what they did even more. Now that I know what's different, now that I know what the alternative is, it doesn't undermine. In fact, the two things support each other very well, I think.
I agree. And a lot of the people you've named and others who wrote songs that the Rodgers and Hart and Cole Porter fans looked down on in the 60s and 70s, those songs have become a new standard repertoire for a lot of jazz singers who are doing great things with them and reclaiming them in a different way.
Well, it's interesting. The point that I make about the difference between them is an Irving Berlin song was sort of written, even though some of those guys, including Berlin on occasion, including Mr. Kern, occasionally they would rail against what jazz musicians were doing. Rodgers did this, but it's a very nuanced matter with Rodgers. But Rodgers sort of didn't mind it if you did it to one of his old songs, but he didn't like it if their song was brand new and somebody completely changed it around. Nobody has ever recorded his reaction to John Coltrane's My Favorite Things, which was done right after that show opened, after The Sound of Music opened on Broadway. But he did say that he loved Benny Goodman, and he did say that he didn't mind it when they did it to one of his old songs, but he would say, let people hear it the way we wrote it first and then come to it. But anyhow, Rodgers is an interesting case. Those songs, to get back to my earlier point, they're sort of written to be interpreted by lots of different people. And that's the point I make. When Irving Berlin wrote the score to Annie Get Your Gun, he had the voice of Ethel Merman in mind. In fact, Ethel Merman was picked even before Berlin was. And he definitely had her voice in his head, but he knew that his great pal Bing Crosby was going to sing the songs. And he also knew that this was still the era of the big bands. He knew that, you know, there's a chance that Count Basie might play it, or Duke Ellington, or for that matter, Guy Lombardo. And anybody who can write a song that can be played by Guy Lombardo or by Count Basie, I mean, that's the whole universe right there between the two of them.
Okay, so right now I feel like I've tuned into an episode of Sing, 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 which is a show that you host on Saturday morning. And we'll get to that in a little bit. I had an order that I was going through, but this is the kind of really...
I spill out all over.
I got a lot of deep information that comes rollicking through your commentary. You seem to have all of this stuff right at your fingertips, which is exciting to hear. But we'll get to the show in a moment.
So, yeah, the point I was hoping to get back to was that when you go to the songs of Tom Waits or Joni Mitchell, usually they're not written with that in mind. Usually
Right.
they would write a song for an album and it's their voice they're thinking about, and they couldn't care less if anybody else performs it. Not that they would object to it necessarily, but it's a very secondary thing. So I think it does take kind of a mental shift to do one of those songs. And the risk inherent in that is, like, if you do a Beatles song, chances are it's going to be pretty rare you're going to come up with something better than the Beatles themselves did. So that's the danger. But of course, terms like better are all relative anyhow. And there have been great interpretations of Beatles songs by jazz musicians and other, creative pop musicians.
Yeah, they don't have to be better, but they do have to be different.
They do have to be original in some way. There has to be some point to it. If you hear it and you say, oh, this is just a mediocre imitation of the Beatles, I mean, it's the same way if you do a Cole Porter song. So many people tend now, amongst young people, a lot of them just tend to parrot what they hear. And so a lot of young artists will take a Sinatra song and pretty much do it exactly the way they hear it without changing it at all, which I don't think is particularly interesting or creative.
Yeah. Apart from the songs themselves, I do want to get back to some of the activities that earned you the plaudits of the Lifetime Achievement Award. You started pretty much writing for newspapers, right?
Yes, back when you should tell your younger listeners exactly what that is.
Yeah,
I don't think they've seen one.
Back when those things that are in the metal boxes on the occasional street corner actually sold for money instead of just inviting you to take them for free.
Begging you to take them for free, right?
Yeah, sort of the triumvirate of New York dailies, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Newsday. You've written for all of those. And
yes.
And I'm wondering if that ever got in the way. Were you writing for all of them at the same time, or any of them at the same time? I know you primarily write for the Wall Street Journal these days, but also the New York Observer and the New York Sun, which are lesser-known papers outside of New York.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there would have been months and years where I would do something for all three. I would have been very happy if they wanted to put me on salary and give me health insurance, but no, that never happened. So, and none of them ever objected to it. So I wish they would have,
Yeah, no,
anyhow,
I think that's the flip side of not putting people on staff. Is it makes it very difficult to say, well, you can't do your work elsewhere, especially since we're not paying you enough. So how did you actually get started in writing for newspapers?
Somehow, when I was working at Tower,
Tower Records, which was a major record store chain.
Now we have to tell people what records are. But
yeah, those are the big platters on vinyl. Well, they're collecting those again now, so they'll know what those are. But there were whole stores that sold them. Yeah.
So I was working at Tower Records for the princely sum of $3.85 an hour in 1983. I was going to college full-time and I was working full-time. I was going to New York University. Of course, then we called it New Amsterdam University. For laughs, we used to see Hamilton, not the Broadway show, but Hamilton himself would come by and hang out with us. It was a bummer when he got shot, I want to tell you. But anywho, I was going to NYU full-time and working full-time. And I met a guy came in. Oh, I should give him full credit. He was Michel Legrand's publisher and Michel Legrand's American publisher. And his name was Jim DiGiovanni, and he was a big music buff. And the great thing about this is it sort of was like we imagined we wanted the internet to be, but never became. When I was working there for $3.85 an hour, I mean, in a sense, they overpaid me because I mostly just schmoozed with customers all day long. I can't think of any actual work I did, but people would come in and they would ask about records and I would tell them and we would talk back and forth. And this guy came in and he was, like I say, Michel Legrand's publisher. And we just kept talking and he kept coming back in and we kept talking. And he said, my buddy Gary Giddens needs an assistant to help with some research for a project he's doing. This was way before Gary did the Bing book. And that's how I got to meet Gary.
That's the Bing Crosby book, just so we can.
Yes, the Bing Crosby book, which came out like 2000 or something, right?
Yeah. Well, and we should also say that Gary was, at that time, the most influential jazz critic in New York. He wrote for the Village Voice. He wrote with great perception and accuracy. And there are still a couple of generations of people who count him as having fostered their own tastes as well as their interest in my case, partly their interest in writing about this music.
I started doing research for Gary, and then he started doing these supplements, the annual jazz supplement, which every year in June, there would be a big jazz festival produced by George Wein. And this was a direct continuation of the Newport Jazz Festival that had begun in Newport in 1954. Eventually, it moved to New York. And in the 70s, 80s, 90s, that was sort of the focal point. It was no longer Newport, even though we did go back to Newport. But the focal point of festival productions was New York, whether it was the Cool Jazz Festival or the JVC Jazz Festival. But it was a really big deal. And people would come from all over the world to this event. And it was such a big event that other festivals started to gather around the same time, like the Knitting Factory put on their own festival. And the Knitting Factory at that point was considered more progressive, more modern, more contemporary than the more traditional, George Wein Festival. But this was also the 92nd Street Y would put on sort of more traditional jazz around the same time. So in June and July, there was a ton of jazz activity. And Gary was able to do these supplements, it was like a little jazz magazine once a year. And my first break for them was he would always do a poll. Sometimes it was a musician's poll, sometimes it was a critic's poll, and I would be the guy that called up everybody. We didn't even have email then, we would just call them. I would put that together, and from there I sort of worked sideways. I made a lateral move into actually writing for the supplement and then writing for the paper, and that was really my first break, was thanks to Gary Giddens letting me do the jazz poll every year. So anybody who wants to follow in my footsteps, all you have to do is go back to 1980 and start from there.
I think there are other ways to go about it these days, but
I wonder. I don't know.
It's very valuable advice. So you wrote through the papers and still continue to review, I know, regularly for the New York Observer and the New York Sun on local events that are happening every day, even though
local and vocal. Well, not just vocal though. No,
I know. And even though these days you are often considered a historian because of the really deep work you've done on some of the things we've mentioned, and especially on liner notes. Let's turn to liner notes, because that's another big aspect of your work. I know you've written several hundred sets. I've seen a figure of 300. I've seen a figure of 600.
I think I've stopped counting around 600. It's probably more like 700.
Okay.
At one point, like 10 years ago, I tried to count them and I stopped at 600. So maybe it's 700 now. Maybe it's 800. I don't know. Anybody wants to count them, let me know.
Yeah. See,
but it's got nothing better to do. But
I did away with that problem a long time ago. I started keeping a running tally. So I actually know. But it's we've both done a lot of work, but yours have been very impressive. You've received 7 Grammy nominations, including twice for different Nat King Cole sets, who is obviously a real touchstone in your area of interest and in your career. I had occasion to revisit the big Nat King Cole box that you did for Mosaic. 18.
Oh, that was a while ago. Yeah.
Well, I was looking something up and I was looking over the notes. It's 25 years ago that roughly that you did that, 1991. And again, it's 18 CDs. So this is a massive tome. But I have to say, I was impressed all over again, even after all this time, at the amount of detail, the amount of work, the amount of specificity, and the sheer readability of what you put
thanks.
together.
Well,
I mean,
that's what we go for, Yeah.
It's like its own book, and I would recommend it to anybody if that set is still in print. Really impressive. But in addition to the history, you've done more recent things. You did liner notes for Samara Joy's recent album.
That's true. I did notes for her first album.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's true.
I remember reading liner notes that you wrote for a Kurt Elling album, another one for Diana Krall, that I read a lot of these and I write a lot of these. And when I read one that makes me sit up and go, that's pretty good, I wouldn't mind have written that myself.
Well, same here.
That's pretty high compliment. And those were there. There have been plenty of those. Now, that's kind of a family business for you, isn't it? Writing liner notes.
It comes and goes. How many have I done this year?
No. I mean, going back to your...
Oh, my dad.
Your paterfamilias.
My father was a really... compared to my father, I know practically nothing about jazz. My dad was one of the original jazz fans in the 50s and 60s. And he only really got credit for the liner notes, but he actually produced this set, I think it's about 12 albums for Riverside. And if you ask any of the musicians, they're all gone now, but if you ask anybody, they would say, yes, it was Herb Friedwald that really did the work of putting those together, even though he didn't get full producer credit. Yeah, it was a great series, part of the New Orleans jazz revival, which really began earlier, right around World War II, but kept going up as long as the first generation was alive, which is in some cases up into the 70s. And those are about 12 truly great albums called New Orleans, The Living Legends, including Percy Humphreys, who was with the Preservation Hall Jazz Band, and Billy and Dee Dee Pierce, who were profound influences on young musicians like Harry Connick Jr. He talks about how he subbed for Billy Pierce when he was really young. So those are just great examples of authentic New Orleans jazz recorded in New Orleans, and I'm very proud that my dad was responsible for those.
And those were for Riverside Records.
Riverside Records for Orrin Keepnews and Bill Grauer.
Yeah, which means he was working with Orrin Keepnews, who was another legendary figure.
A legendary figure, to be sure.
Absolutely. How much of the fact that your dad wrote liner notes got you interested in writing liner notes?
Well, I'm sure there was some direct connection. I remember I didn't hardly write any until after I had done my first book. And then people started giving me calls to do this. And it was really great timing because I was a guy who could do this at the point when the CD was coming in, and all of a sudden people were reissuing everything, and there was this huge reissue boom, particularly in the 90s, that I was able to surf the wave of, and that really along with stories and newspapers, that really, paid the rent for many years, liner notes.
It's interesting because liner notes have sometimes been suspect. First of all, in the 1940s and 50s, they were press releases. They were often just some blather on the back of an LP that said very little about the music and was full of cliches and complimentary phrases. To this day, I mean, there's a writer that I know who regularly demeaned those who wrote liner notes because they were being paid by the artist or the company. And I think that you, and I certainly do, look at these as a particular form of essay that has information that really doesn't appear often in other places, except when somebody quotes the liner notes in an article, that form a sort of ongoing history. If it's modern artists, then it's the history as it's happening. If it's older artists, it's a sort of a history of how the interpretations and analysis and appreciation of those artists is developing over time. I think that they're a very valuable addition to the literature, and I think that you are one of the people who exemplifies that.
Oh, thank you. Well, yeah, that's what we try for, You want to...
That's what you try for. Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about radio. For 2.5 years or so, which is roughly the same time that I have been your remote colleague. We don't work in the same place, the same studio, or even the same city, but we both do programs for KSDS, which is a station in San Diego that a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, got the idea of bringing in people from around the country to supplement their own hosts and try to turn it into a national jazz station. So I host one of the weeknight slots, Jazz Across America, from different cities every Saturday morning on KSDS, which is jazz88.org, if people want to try to find it online. So on Saturday mornings there, airing at 10 a.m. in San Diego, which is 1 p.m. in New York, but streaming in real time, you do the show called Sing, Sing, Sing. And I've caught a couple of those. And folks, what you're hearing from Will Friedwald right now in this interview is what you hear on Sing, Sing, Sing. It's a stream of information punctuated by great cuts, deep cuts very often, and really putting them into a historical perspective. Had you done radio before this? I know you've done some video presentations, some online presentations about theater and music.
I did radio in college. I worked for WNYU, which people who are attuned to the history of punk rock will tell you that WNYU was like the station because it was right in the middle. It was, we were like 10 blocks from CBGB's. It was right in the Village at the height of the punk rock movement in the 70s.
So who were the punk rock artists that you played most frequently, Will?
Well, that's it. They had other stuff too. And I did some jazz, and one of my early heroes was a guy named Rich Conity, who did the show called The Big Broadcast for 30 years, which was just music from the 20s and 30s. And I was on WNYU. I did a show that sort of emulated that, playing music from the 78 era. Then I brought it up to the big band era, up into the swing era, and did a Sinatra show there for a while. I did a whole bunch of stuff in college, but I wasn't able to really appear except in interviews and such for a long time. And I didn't really start doing my own show until I got the call from Ken Poston at KSDS, which was July
2.5 years ago.
Yeah, July 2022. Yes.
Yeah. And it was a pleasure to see you join that group. It's really a fine lineup, and I do urge people to check out the program either when it's on.
And so here's more very useful career advice. If you want to get a show on KSDS, first you spend 40 years writing book after book and 700 liner notes and 5,000 articles, and then maybe they'll consider you for a show on KSDS. So again, you have to go back to 1980 kind of to do it, but
See,
I'm
that's
sure that
what's-
people can figure that one out.
That's what's so amazingly different now is that pretty much anybody can start their own YouTube radio show, their own podcast.
Or a podcast.
They
whatever,
can do
right.
they can do all those things without having to wait for a call from a radio station, and many people do with mixed results. I mean, as I'm sure you will agree, because everyone I know our age does. We live in an era without gatekeepers, which is a great thing so that people can get things out that never would have come out before. But it's a problem because people can get things out that never would have come out before. And sometimes there was good reason for that.
Right. Yeah, it's a mixed bag.
It's definitely a mixed bag. But I do urge people to check out the radio thing, because that's sort of the latest feather in your cap in terms of your career. But now let's talk about your Substack column, which is really fascinating. It's called Slouching Towards Birdland. How did you come up with the title? Obviously, it's a play on Slouching Toward Bethlehem by Joan
Right.
Didion.
It was Joan Didion. Even before that, it was Yeats, right? William Butler Yeats.
Oh, I think you're right. Yes.
Yeah. It was just irreverent. It's something that was high class and, I mean, something that was literary, but also funky at the same time. So that was it, you know?
Yeah.
But my kind of workload now is when you're writing for newspapers, it can be something old and historical, but it has to be a new peg. Like you can't just write about Lester Young. You have to wait for Mosaic to do a Lester Young set. And then you can write about Lester Young. So everything I do for the New York Sun and the Journal pretty much is contemporary, or which has a grand peg like that, a centennial or something. It has to have some sort of contemporary relevance. But with Substack, you can just write about anything. I can just pick any song, any artist, anything I want to write. And hopefully people will dig it. And that's what I like, is that you don't need to have that connection. You can just pick anything you like. So most of my work for the Sun in particular is reviewing. I mean, it's a real shame in New York, except for the New York Sun, nobody reviews live local music. Like last week, I wrote about Ken Poplawski. This week, I wrote about Emmett Cohen. Nobody in the Journal. I mean, I love the Journal, but not the Times, not the Journal. We don't cover live local music anymore. That's the only place I get to do that. And conversely, the random historical stuff that I just feel like writing. Oh, here's an interesting song from 1922, goes into Substack, and people seem to like it, you know?
Well, I like it, and I do want to recommend it. I was just looking at I think the most recent entry this morning, the one called Ebb Tide. In case listeners haven't figured this out, Will is full of puns and some really lively, if sometimes questionable, humor, if you don't mind my saying.
Questionable, but hopefully not objectionable. But
no,
yeah.
not objectionable. But Ebb Tide is looking at the songwriter Fred Ebb of Candor and Ebb. And I mean, this is not something you read in 6 minutes. Not that it's thorny to read. It's long. It's packed with information. There are a dozen music and video clips embedded there. And if somebody was to sit down and say, well, let me see what he's talking about, and here's the example he's given me, you can spend a good half hour. You can spend a good half hour on any of these, and it's a good half hour spent. It's well spent to really get into the subject if someone is that interested in it. But I'm always impressed by the amount of casual knowledge, facts that are just dropped in sort of off the cuff, sometimes mixed in with something about a New York performance that's just taken place, about lesser known gems, songs. There was a column recently or not long ago about the Barry sisters, which is a vocal
group that was fun.
That nobody remembers. You did things on the centennials of Dinah Washington and Sarah Vaughan.
Their daughter called me, not their daughter, one of their daughters.
Really?
Well, the daughter of one of them called me. So, yeah, somebody remembers them.
So she remembers them. Yes, it's her aunt. And especially I would recommend the 16 columns that you wrote after Tony Bennett's demise, which were a series of stories based on your time spent with him working on his book. Those are fascinating. And I think this is really good current history, or current journalism as history, or history as journalism. I think it combines both in a way that is quite admirable.
Well, this is, again, like I say, for the random stuff in the past, it's fun to put that onto Substack precisely because a regular newspaper, the news being the operative term, a regular newspaper, not so much,
Yeah. But again, taking all these things into consideration, it's not hard to figure out, even if you were nominated for 10 years, why you received the Jazz Journalists Association Lifetime Achievement Award in 2024. Tell me what you're working on right now before we wrap this up.
Just more Substacks. I'm pushing a couple book ideas. I just had a book come out where For many years, I wanted to do what Gary Giddens and Francis Davis and a lot of the writers, I'm pretty sure you've done it too, which is take a collection of some of my favorite pieces and put that into book form that all originally were from the Journal and the Sun and other places. And as I was going through some of my favorite stories over the last 40 years, I realized that I had enough just on piano players to fill a book. And that became this new book, which I call Nights at the Red Steinway, Adventures in Jazz Piano, which has just been published by Backbeat Books. I'm very proud. And so it's the first time I've written a book on an aspect of jazz that isn't about singers. So that's good. So now people will think of me as the piano guy, and that'll be
the piano man.
That's right.
Yeah, go hang out with Billy Joel.
We go to the same barber. I'll put it that way.
Will Friedwald, thanks so much for joining us here on The Buzz, and congratulations again on the award. I'll hope to see you soon. I'll certainly be reading the Substack column and listening to you on KSDS-FM.
And thank you, Neil, and I'll be listening and reading you as well.
Take care. Thank you, Will Friedwald. Thanks also to our editor, Wiz Petta. And don't miss new episodes of The Buzz. Make sure you follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Neil Tesser.